Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and salutations. I would also throw in there a welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quests. My name is Tristan, and I am joined by Russ. Hi, Russ.
Hey, how's it going today, Tristan?
Yes, for you first-time joiners, I come from the professional services background of AWS, and what I do is help customers accelerate their cloud journey in a secure manner and fashion and way and form. And Russ comes from where again?
The customer incident response team. I
Yes.
hope I don't have to see you.
Yes. We always like to play off of that because it is fun to have a conversation and talk about where everybody's coming from, as well as maybe some of the viewers out there. So feel free to let us know in the chat, where is everyone from?
Or don't, and we will OSINT game find you. That works too.
Yes, 100%. Right. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, we'll tell you when we find it. No, I digress. So, JK, as they might say. But if you don't want to answer that question, we have a second question for you. That is a little bit more specific. What I mean by that is, depending on where you are, it's either breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And what I mean by that with the question is, what is your favorite appetizer? That is a good question. And I throw this to Russ. Appetizer.
It's a really tough question. Originally, I was thinking about cheating and using an answer like a sampler or something like that. But it is cheating, so I'm just gonna go ahead and stick to my guns and say mozzarella sticks.
Mozzarella sticks. Yes, that's an old faithful right there, and it's
like that for a reason.
Yeah, it's there. It's up there. It's top 10, I would say. And I would go with, if I see, you have to break it down. It's either breakfast, lunch, or dinner, right? So I would say, if we're around the lunch dinner time frame, coconut shrimp. That is kind of my thing, you know, the little sauce, the dipping, and everything like that. Keep like 100 of those, or one, depending on where you go, because the prices may vary. For breakfast, though, that is, what do you think of hash browns? That's a staple, right? That's a side. Some may consider even a main. But sure, like, thank you for joining us from New Jersey, and curious on what's your breakfast food. But thank you, as we digress and kind of go off the rails as we always do. What we're here to talk about is something fun, right? But Russ, what is that fun?
Today we're going to talk about container security, which is everyone's favorite topic. Not really, but it is, becoming a very hot button topic, and is, kind of been increasing as a subdomain of cybersecurity. So it's been pretty interesting, and I can't wait to talk more about it.
Yeah,
I'm definitely more on the learning side today. I am not the most experienced with container security, so I can't wait.
Russ is just being modest. Throw all of your container security advanced 400 level questions right at him. He'll knock them out of the park. But I would say, if we were to start with container security, but I think, what did we cover last week that might coincide with advanced container security? Or,
of course,
mental.
Yeah, definitely. So last week on the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest, we did our Aura Farming Identity, or AWS IAM Advanced Power-Ups. So we went into a little bit more advanced IAM topics. We talked about authentication methods, federation, identity center, some stuff like that. But you don't have to have watched last week's episode to understand what's going on today. So feel free to stick around if you didn't make last week's episode.
Yeah, it would help a little bit, just a tad bit, depending on where you are in your container layered cake approach, I always say. But I think a place to start is, let's see how many people have container security challenges. That's kind of how we learn about stuff, right? So if you think about your environment, what is your biggest container security challenge? See, we have 1, 2, 3, or 4. Make sure to put it in the chat. And I would say, for The thing that always gets me is number one, the image vulnerabilities, because having conversations with different customers and how they're building images and their golden pipeline and how they're building and stacking and all of that, that's kind of where I come from. What about you, Russ?
I would say, just based off of what I've seen from incidents, configuration management seems to be a big one. Yeah, I think there's a lot to consider with container security. So, but that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, and we have Victor. I'm an expert in container security or security in layers or containers from a Microsoft. Well, thank you for joining. I'll be interested to hear your perspective. As you know, we are novices that are coming to the stage today that we'll get to where we're going with that. But I have to digress and say hello from Florida and even a DevSecOps for development. Nice. So we have our first, I would say my biggest container security challenge is probably the cookie jar. Everyone keeps stealing them. There's been reports of a monster that's been stealing cookies out of a cookie jar. He's about blue and he's about yay high. So be on the lookout for that. I digress and I pull back from that analogy. So continue to drop 1, 2, 3, or 4 because right now we are leaning towards one particular area. Yeah, runtime. That is an interesting place. Yeah. And often that's kind of the thing where you might have that initial piece or conversation that organizations kind of look at. Okay, how do we scan this piece? How do we track this piece, right? Because yeah, there's a lot of components that get into it, but we'll pull it back for now, and we'll take it easy, or maybe we won't. We'll just zoom in a little bit and talk about containers as an overall approach, right? So, what are we talking about today? Well, we want to start off with, let's say, an overview. What is container security? Right? What are the practices, the tools, and strategies about implementing and protecting containers within your environment? And then dialing out to talking about some of the fundamentals of container security. What are the elements that you need to put together? Right? What are the 5 mini cats that need to come together and form one big cat? If you get that reference, 10 points to you. So after you talk about those foundational fundamentals, we want to get into the customer challenges, as well as, hey, how or what should I use from a practical standpoint when it comes to dealing and kind of navigating the world of container security? So that's where we're coming from. But there's a lot of components that we have to have a quick chat and talk about, right? Up close and personal. And we want to say that we need to bring a friend into this conversation, right? Because it's dangerous to go alone, as we always say. And we need a sage to talk about the layered approach of container security, to talk about how do I protect the runtime? How do I protect the images? How do I scan within the environment, right? Say we're novices today. How do we get to the next step? How do we get to the L200 or 300 or 400? Maybe 500. I think that's where you start to see containers on the ceiling or something, and you start to map them around. I don't know about you, Russ. Do you do that?
Containers inside of containers inside of containers.
Yeah, it's just like when you have the 2 video conferences looking at each other. It's just like that. That's where we're coming from, right? But I always digress. But I think that sets it up perfectly to bring our sage from the container space. And may I add, a very good security professional. Welcome, Hardik. How are you doing today?
Hello, everyone. I'm doing great. How are you folks?
Doing fine. We have a random beverage of choice that has, a caffeinated properties to it. So doing 100% okay. So
I'm just now realizing that we may need an applause like sound audio bit so we can play it every time we introduce our new sage.
Yes, I think we need the 90s track to any let's say 90s sitcom. Yeah, that would work, right? They always use this around the same time.
Yeah.
But See, we get off the rails too much. But Hardik, I would say, where are you coming in from?
Yeah. So once again, I'm Hardik. I'm a senior security prototyping SA coming from GFS side of the house, which is Global Financial Services. I specialize in security foundations on AWS. And in my day-to-day, I architect and engineer prototypes with security mindset that enable my customers to either migrate or deploy workloads on AWS.
Yeah. And this is why we brought Hardik in as the sage, as you can tell. And before we get into the prototyping and talking about container security, what is your favorite appetizer? The crowd they're waiting to know.
Clamoring to know.
I hope people kind of could have guessed it, but it's something which is kind of famous Indian appetizer. It's paneer tikka. It's cottage cheese skewered that you grill, and it's absolutely delicious. If you have not tried it, do try it.
Yeah, I think I've had it. It is actually really good. I just didn't know the name. So thank you for that. Now I have to order it along with mozzarella sticks. So you got my
what
lunch.
An interesting restaurant you're going to go to.
Yeah, exactly. I'm originally from Queens, New York. So it's kind of like walking from door to door, kind of thing. So, but Hardik, now that we got the appetizer out the way and we're going and delving into the world of container security, I would say a way to kick us off is when you're thinking of container security, what is your container security motto?
Great question. My container security motto is defense in depth. As we know, containers is a layer-based approach. So we at AWS recommend a layer-based security approach when thinking or approaching containers. And I'll get right into it by what I mean by that, which is you have to think about different aspects when coming to containers, like image security, how to keep the images minimal, the non-root execution, the read-only file system mechanism that you should be implementing, keeping those resources limited, thinking about security in the pipeline or how you're creating these images, diving into the identity and access management pieces, and also thinking about the network security. So these are the different things that come into by ensuring the defense in depth approach.
Yeah, I would 100% plus one to that, especially when you think of containers and exactly what you said, the defense in depth, because there are so many different parts. When you ever go to a container talk, right, and you start to walk through the layers of the onion, each one of those layer pieces has different components that you need to consider. And it all boils down to a couple of things of, all right, images. What's your base image? And then after that image runs, what is it doing? What is it calling? Things of that nature. And then networking, as you mentioned, right? Of who has access after it is up and running. So there's different, I would say, mechanism. You said is container isolation mechanism, let's say, where you have namespaces and things of that nature that you can kind of leverage with that.
Yep. Great point, Tristan. Which is why before I dive into what I just said, let's take a step back and understand how are containers different from virtual machines, right? There's like a lot of aspects that come into picture from like an isolation perspective, as you just touched upon. Containers use namespaces or control groups and share the OS kernel, unlike virtual machines that have full isolation via the hypervisor. And each VM has its own operating system. This makes it kind of like challenging from an attack surface perspective because the shared kernel increases the risk if the container escapes, which is not something that you get on a virtual machine. From a security responsibility perspective, given that you are having an operating system which is with a shared kernel, you are having a shared responsibility at an OS level. Unlike on a virtual machine, the cloud provider has a clear boundary, making sure that the hypervisor is secure. Talking about some of the security controls, the containers need runtime protection, and VM has a lot of security controls already baked in at a hypervisor level. From an image standpoint, definitely when creating, you should have scanning implemented, fail the images, lock them down if there is vulnerability found out later. And then thinking about privilege escalation, as you mentioned, because if you're running things at a root level, having execution possible at that time, it can cause more issues.
Yeah, definitely. I would start to go down the path of, hey, let's talk about each one of these things, but then it'll be about an 8-hour show. And I think you mentioned some fundamentals that are key, right? Just understanding what a container is. And kind of the simplified view of how I look at containers is I usually go to the video game space, right? You remember the Space Invaders game where you have 100 of those aliens coming down? Then how do you know if one of those aliens is a special one, right? And in this case is, how do you know if something's malfunctioning or somebody has access to one of those items, right? If it's not a different color or glowing or something along those lines. And I think that's one of the ways you start to dig into, okay, how do I know? And you mentioned scanning, and you mentioned kind of what are the different base images that are being used and privilege and things of that nature. So it's also a good question, but what can you do about an audit? That is an interesting, deep question that can also go into 8 hours, because when you're auditing, what are you trying to achieve within that audit? What I mean is, are you trying to meet a specific, let's say, standard, let's PCI or something along those lines? Because then there's going to be a bunch of components that go into it and providing evidence and things of that nature. So I think when we're thinking of foundational items, to answer your question a little bit more detailed, is you're looking at what mechanisms and tools you have in place within your environment and how those tools are providing logs and evidence collection and things of that nature. So, yeah.
Absolutely on point, Tristan. Just to give a bit more deeper insight into it, we at AWS provide with great amount of services that help you from an auditing perspective. Like you have CloudTrail, and if you're running containers in multiple regions, all you have to do is create a multi-region trail. And now you can turn on guard duty, which is monitoring these events. And if you're turning on certain features within guard duty for EKS protection and runtime protection, that identify these anomalies that are happening in your container. Also, you can have all the logs from your container stream through CloudWatch, which you can centralize and then monitor them with intelligence that you can bake in or use other tools that are available out there to kind of like notify you when something is not as expected.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also touched upon some of the IAM roles and things of that nature, and allowing access to, let's say, a specific ECS task role or something along those, or EKS pod identity, right? Depending on which service you're looking at, right? You always want to, and I always say this 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet: least privilege, least privilege, least privilege, right? And when you start to look at containers, that's one of the things you mainly want to look at, because now that you have such granularity in place, you want to make sure that practice, that fundamental approach is still there. So we also have the question or the statement: when the entire security perspective or practice came there, when you really don't need any further or even to re-implement the same container. And this is an important part, I would say, as well. And then when you think about your target state security strategy, as I mentioned as well, these are all parts of the puzzle that come together. When you're looking at, let's say, what you mentioned, recovering a host, or how you spin up a host, or who has access to the host, and how long do they have access for. You can start to go down the trail of what we were talking about last week of the just-in-time access components and the governance strategy. So, Hardik, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that piece?
No, that is spot on, right? Because containers are short-lived. Thinking from a perspective of IAM, having mechanisms baked in to identify how you can backtrack and then get into those details is really important.
Exactly. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is, how do we go about testing these different components? And the way we test is, well, it's interesting. So we have a specific poll for that feel free for the audience to look at, is how do you test your container security? And we got this theme of, hey, your another container needs your help, right? If you know where this background comes, it comes from a specific video game, and some of these concepts might always also apply. So when you're thinking about how do you test, do you take the scientist role where you have a formal test and you have the scientific method? Or are you a little bit of a scrapper where you're just piecing together ad hoc testing methodologies? Or are you exploring through continuous scanning? Or are you the lone wanderer that's not doing any testing yet? It's just, hey, I'm playing around. I'm in my little sandbox. I'm in my environment just doing things. So feel free to put 1, 2, 3, 4 in the chat. Be curious to know. But Hardik, Russ, where are you coming from with this? What option do you pick?
So I would.
can
Oh,
Go ahead, Russ.
So I would be picking Explorer, continuous scanning. That's what I would like to be doing with my containers. But I'd love to hear your answer.
Yeah, my answer is the same, which is continuous scanning, because there's no point where you might want to stop looking at things. Given the landscape we are in, cloud, it's ever evolving, right? So are the threats and the vulnerabilities coming to kind of take things down. So continuous scanning is the way forward.
Yeah, and because I have the DR in front of my name, I think I have to take the scientific approach. It was just formulated into me. Formal testing and kind of ways to speed up that formal testing process. So be curious as results start to come in. But I think one of the places to start as we're diving in and trying to understand container security fundamentals, really. Right? We talked about containers versus virtual machines. We talked about, let's say, maybe something like ECS and EKS, which are different AWS services, where ECS provides a more simpler AWS native container experience opposed to EKS, which is more of a standard Kubernetes approach. Right? And depending on where you are, as Hardik was mentioned, some of the shared responsibility model starts to come into play. So there's different components that you need to take into consideration, especially if you're going more of the EKS route. So just things to think about if you haven't delved into your container security journey yet. But that also kind of reminds me of a story. And this is where I guess I zoom in and we take that step back. Because if we're going to tell a story about containers, I think that story should be a legendary side quest. And that's why we take the momentary pause and say, hey, I think it's time for a side quest. And for your first time, join us. What is a side quest? Well, side quest is exactly what it is. It's not your main mission, but what are the little steps? What are the 1 pieces or the 2 pieces or the 3 pieces of XP that you gathered along your security journey to say, hey, maybe we should do something else. Maybe we should try something else. And that's where we get to, as Side Quest Legend has it. So today we speak about a tale of a security engineer at a fast growing, let's say, e-commerce this time around. They're charged with managing container deployments across multiple cloud environments. They are facing increasing pressure to maintain security while scaling rapidly, which is always the case. And today, to help our story along, we have our old faithful side quest board. And what this side quest board is just a visual example of different services and different paths that you can take, because it's almost like a choose your own adventure. But you want to make sure your adventure is secure along the route. And you don't want to kind of go off track. I was going to say a specific Oregon Trail reference, but I held back on it. Again, 10 points if you get that reference. So we have our authenticated user going down the route. We have the context behind them of, hey, I need to get my containers secure along this path. So if I were to delve into this today, where do I go? Well, I have the first step. And I would say the first step along the way is talking about certain things like, I don't know, identity or logs, or where would you start out, Hardik, for today?
I would start at the image building process.
Okay. So you're starting out at the image building process itself. Are you going the ECS or EKS route?
Great question. It's kind of tough to choose because ECS offers tighter integration with AWS services and simplifies it. And EKS, I get more freedom, flexibility, and I can have more granular control. But I would have to do more configuration and then think about some other aspects that I don't get out of the box from ECS. But today, to keep it simple, I think I would go with ECS.
You go with ECS? All right. So if we're going the ECS route and we have our different items in place, you know what? I throw the curveball at you, right? Hey, we're using ECS. That's the path we wanted to take. But hey, some senior leadership says, no, we have Kubernetes in place already. Why don't we just use that? So we don't have to relearn a different system. This is a common path, especially when you're going on side quests of, hey, I was throwing up an ECS. It's simple. It's managed. And no, we have this department that knows ECAS. So we want to use that. So now I have to start to think about it. I have to start to pivot. How do I figure this piece out? Well, I think when we're talking about security and we're talking about how we can possibly go down the route of understanding is maybe what are the challenges that we have? Let's think about that. We have developers in the environment that they can be deploying unauthorized images. There's lack of consistent security controls. There's no standardized for process for, let's say, secret management, or there's limited visibility into runtimes because we brought that up earlier. So these are all the challenges. I guess when it comes to, let's say, controlling container security, I pose this to our great sage today. What's your primary container security control that you look for?
A control that I look for, it's not really one, right? It's to have this multiple controls together, which I think that's where deploying these images in ECR and enabling the scanning with the help of inspector is kind of helpful, because it helps me not only identify the issues in the image, but also now I can put immutability tag, knowing that my images cannot be modified. And I can also like have other controls baked in with that. So just helps me overall. So I know it's not kind of like the very straightforward, simple answer, given that's how container security is.
Yeah, and it's defense in depth. It's a layered approach. And we're moving the target over. Why? Because now, okay, we say EKS and we're going down the route of, okay, ECR, right? We have the images. We're trying to make sure that it's standardized, it's working to what we need it to work for. So now we start to go down the route of, all right, are we taking a step back by understanding if, hey, what's going on within the logs? If we were to go up instead of, down towards our AWS environment, because when we're thinking of CloudTrail, this is how we're knowing what's going on as a key mechanism, right? We talked about audits, we talked about all those different items, but I think that's one of the paths that we can take, especially along the side quest route. So CloudTrail, what would we use CloudTrail for? I posed that question and I placed CloudTrail up in attack mode.
My favorite, logs.
Yeah. So CloudWatch would like to have a word with you and VPC after the show. So, but we say all this in jest, but what we're really looking at is how users are leveraging the different pieces of the environment. And what I mean by that is, hey, I'm using EKS, I'm using ECR, I'm looking at CloudTrail logs. Maybe I have things like, I don't know, guard duty in place. Maybe I have other considerations that I need to take into account for. Like you mentioned, like like secrets management, right? Things of that nature that we need to continue on looking out for as we're making our path across to our AWS environment. I would say, what is the solution? I think part of that is making sure that we have a pipeline approach. That's kind of where it's going now. Of, all right, if we have a pipeline that we have ECR in place, then we can start to talk about, okay, our images getting inspected along that pipeline. Are things getting scanned? Are vulnerabilities being identified? Do we look at, hey, are we supposed to have privileged access to this or are we not? And you see the path starts to get thicker along the way because there's so many steps. And this is not the usual side quest path because there's a defense in depth approach that we're talking about, right? So when you're thinking of other methods, and I pose this to our sage, is what are the potential attacks on your container settlement, let's say, right? If we were to take this back to our gaming analogy, what are the possible things that we can help to prevent outside of these tools?
We can help prevent privilege escalation, which is important because if somehow your containers are getting, like if you're able to do privilege escalation and escape from the container, you are now able to like easily go around because you're using the same kernel OS. It just gets out of hands, right? So you don't want that to happen, and preventing that actually makes it is the right way to go ahead. Some other things that we can prevent is by doing the scannings with the help of inspector. We now know if the images from the get-go have critical or high vulnerabilities. We can prevent those images from being used and take them down, right? And then kick in automated workflows which create new images, and these ones are clean so that they can be used. Thinking from like a secrets perspective, because we have secrets manager on the board, is not baking secrets into images, ensuring that way the secrets do not get leaked, and actually leveraging secrets manager. And to add more security to it, we can even encrypt these secrets with KMS CMKs, where we can have custom policies which add more security to it, ensuring that only pre-approved resources are being accessed, and bake all of that in together.
Yeah. And you make a couple of good points that I think flows right into Russ's lane of kind of the incident response side of, hey, something happened within, the container world. It's like, what do I do? Kind of, Russ, what do you think of that piece, right? It's just, hey, we need something automated to fix it. What are you seeing from your side?
Yeah, I think that there's that's definitely the case. We definitely see that there is a lack of that sort of tooling from the incident side. So like the processes and the mechanisms in the incidents that I've seen just aren't there. So that defense in depth, there's that weak link because it's just not happening.
Yeah, and I think that is a good place to hit the pause game button, or the Zach Morris timeout, as I say, as we take a step back and kind of start to look at, hey, what else do we need to think about, right? We're talking about automation, we're talking about different tools, but I think we need to take a second to focus on maybe one tool to start off with. And since we have our sage here, I think we can start to, I guess, talk about one. What tool comes to your mind, oh great sage, for today?
I'd say inspector comes to my mind, given that it is really, really helpful. And the second reason why inspector comes to mind, just apart from the direct integration that it has with ECR, is when running containers, we need some sort of compute, right? Be it ECS or EKS, you still need to run them. Are you going to run them on EC2, or are you going to run them on Fargate? And a lot of times people prefer to use and manage their own instances to run as compute. So to guard those instances as well and have monitoring on them as well, inspector becomes this tool which is really helpful for share for kind of like seeing what it provides out of the box.
Yeah, and I think that is a good place to start off, especially when we're like really thinking about, hey, what tools do, if I were to pick a tool to have as a foundational starting point, I think Inspector does a couple of different things that, different people within, let's say, the world, I always like the world or globally can use, right, in order to understand what is happening within their containers themselves. What I also pose and throw the question to chat as well is, when you think of tools with containers, like, hey, what are you using out there in order to, let's say, scan for vulnerabilities or look for things happening within the environment? Because every customer has their tool belt, things of that nature. So feel free to drop in the comment section. And also feel free to ask or answer some of the questions that we post. Because when you think about container security, you think of appetizers, right? Because as you're thinking about the triple, no, I could bring it there, but we got to stick to one tool. So with that one tool, Hardik, what are we looking at right now?
If you can see, I'm right in my AWS console and going to my favorite tool, which is Inspector. Not only you get sort of like a nice dashboard view where you can see different things. This is one of my test environments. You can see that I have my direct integration with ECR, and I'm actually able to see the findings and the images that I have. And you can see from a perspective of severity. Taking a little step back, you can not only just see it from like a container repository, but also at an image level. And as I was saying, if you're going down the EC2 route, and you can even then have like your instances which show the vulnerabilities in those instances. Going to take a brief pause before we go into more other things, just in case if someone has questions or something like that.
Yeah, I think this is a very important piece to show, is kind of how much information you have with, I would say, not that much work to start off with. If you're just doing the regular, let's say, starting out ClickOps approach of, I'm going through the console, I am just looking at, hey, what tools can I use? This gives you a lot of information with, I would say, minimum lift, especially when you're running containers within your environment. And this is important because when you're thinking of what we were talking about before, when we were looking at auditing and just thinking about how do I build out my target state security strategy? Well, this is how you start identifying, hey, I thought I had defense in depth, but I have these criticals, I have these highs. What is going on within my environment? What am I missing? And then you start to walk backwards from there, right? And Hardik, I think that's where you're also going with this as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that I forgot about Inspector, which I've just seeing on console, just reminds me is SBOMs, right? You can also leverage Inspector to do SBOM generation, which is get all the software bill of materials which are being used and kind of scan and then ensure that what you're building is really good for use, is not having any issues, and approved with the standards compliance requirements that your organization is supposed to follow.
Yeah. And that's an important part, because sometimes images, they might get baked in with something that's not part of your organizational. They might not be licensed. They might be, let's say, shareware or something along those lines that are built into the image. And one, you want to make sure your images have the minimum items in it to start off with. You want to avoid that bloat, because you'd be surprised of how much, oh, that's just standard that comes in here that you might not need. It's just causing excessive bloat within your image. But I digress on that point. But the other part of that is there might be potential vulnerabilities that you would have by not knowing what software is deployed, because, hey, this cool tool worked in order to help me get this app up. but I didn't. My security team didn't vet it. It's open source, and there's a bunch of code that I don't understand, so I'm just going to use. So those are the kind of pieces that you want to make sure that, hey, you have this in play and understand within your environment.
A very critical point raised there, Tristan. Definitely there's always like ensure that you're dropping the unnecessary capabilities by using the Docker security context and getting rid of the things that you know are not needed and keeping only the absolute minimal things required by following the privilege of least principle.
Yeah, exactly. And Russ, have you seen from kind of your side of the fence of just images that went off the rails, for lack of better words?
Yes, absolutely. And I have seen instances where people just didn't know what was their image and what was not. They weren't keeping track, or it's so easy when you're just using these kind of random names to just figure out that naming convention and kind of hide these images if you don't know what is yours and what is not. So yes, I think this is a super great tool for kind of just knowing what you have and being able to baseline before an incident.
You mean image 1 and image 2 and image 3 are not good naming conventions?
Apparently not.
V1 through 5. Yeah. That also brings up the point of tags, but that's a different conversation, right? Just make sure your tagging strategy is efficient and also optimized for your organization. But side quest for another
really
day.
Complex.
Yeah. But back to you, Hardik.
Yeah, so this is where, as Tristan was saying, it is super easy to use Inspector and setting it up, be it you're using it in a single account or in an organization. Setting it up is matter of a few clicks, or getting that resource and being deployed through Terraform if you're using Terraform, through CloudFormation, CDK, SDK, whatever route you choose. It's pretty straightforward. You have a lot of examples out there. You can even use the things that we have on our AWS samples to get it up and running. So there are a lot of places from where you can start. And if you're confused as well, you can reach out to us and we'll enable you, because that's what we do, especially Tristan and I. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do. And I have to zoom in and say, that's what we do. You just have to take that step back and then step forward into the camera. Dramatic. This is how we build aura. We talked about this last episode. We just want to continue the trend because you want to farm some aura, especially when it comes around container security as well. So as we start to go through and understand container security, I think part of the question or the challenge is how do I power up my container security strategy? And I think that's a question that we want to also kind of throw to the audience as well. So chat, select your container security power up. Since we're going with a typical game of the Fallout variety, we have the image scanning shield, we have runtime protection potions, we have network policy arm, we have secret management scrolls, SMS. I was just spelling that out in my head. I'm like, that might get confusing, but each one of these adds plus 10, plus 15 of detection and the isolation. What are you choosing? Put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. Feel free. Let me know what power up. But Russ, start with you this time. What power up are you choosing off the bat?
See, I think you knew which one was best, which is secret management scroll, and that's why it's only plus 8, because it is the one that I would choose, secret management scroll.
And Hardik, where are you going?
I'm going with number 2 because I'm going to be a little naive at this point and think of like an amazing container use case where I don't have to deal with secrets at all. However, I know that no matter how non-secret information is there or something like that, I would want the runtime protection detection, which makes my life easier to know if something is going fun, like something funny is happening, something unexpected is happening. I can like make sure that is taken down, or make sure that no matter what happens, the service I'm trying to provide is still up and running fine.
It's a good choice. But do you have a scroll? No. It's funny because this is hard to choose, right? Because when you're looking at it, it depends on, hey, what part of the life cycle are you dealing with this, right? Because usually when you're talking to different customers, you have the platform team, and then you have the security team, and then you have the governance team. And when you think about this kind of goes to that, right? So are you on the platform side talking about network policy armor? Because, hey, I have to put up WAFs and I have to do all these other things within my environment. But for the sake of, I would say, coolness, that's one of the factors that we left off here, plus 10 coolness, I would go with the image scanning shield. Just because I like to have stuff like ECR or Inspector or something along those lines that have everything nice and neat, buttoned up for me to take a look at, to say, okay, this is how my environment currently looks. So that's kind of where I lean with it. But it brings up a couple of, good points, I would say. And continue to put 1s, 2s in the chats, because I think chat was leaning towards 2. So that's an important part when you think of runtime protection potion. Chat is taking the potions. Maybe I'm off. Wait, did we all pick something different?
Yes.
So it's funny how life works out like that. It's because we're starting to become one, as one container should be. And then we multiply. So when we're thinking of container security and the strategy, I think part of it is helping to build your knowledge, to build up your aura, so you're just like Hardik, right? When you come in with all the container security knowledge in the world and you say, this is what you need to do. Listen to me. This is what you need to do. And we'll pull back out. And I think part of the way you build the aura that Hardik has is you go on a knowledge quest. And you may ask yourself, what is a knowledge quest? Well, this is essentially the homework assignment for this show. But on a more fun note, it's different pieces where you can go from L100 content to L200 and L300, and then come back and report. Hey, reach out to us on LinkedIn or any other socials and say, hey, I did this. I completed this thing. I read this article, which is the first step. That's all you need, is just to take that what is it, the first leap of faith. So when you start to think about that, especially in the container security world, I think that's an important concept to understand, right? Is you're not going to know everything in one day. It is too deep and too vast. You need to take one step at a time and break things down to the 1s and 0s, as I say. But Hardik, Russ, do you agree with that? It's kind of like an ocean at that point, right?
Absolutely agree.
100%.
Yeah. So, and with that ocean, if we were to dive in, let's say from the standpoint of foundational items, I think if we go to L100, we're a vault dweller in training. We didn't even leave our vault yet. We're just in here trying to run simulations on and try to figure out what's happening. I think the important part to consider, to think about, to dive into is, hey, what does the documentation say? Especially if we were just talking about scanning. So, all right, how do we kind of scan items? How do we go about doing this? There's an article, there's some documentation, image scanning. So Amazon ECR, we're a vault dweller in training. So what's the difference between enhanced scanning and basic scanning? These are questions that you start to ask yourself, especially when it says important up in the top of the screen, right? But these are different approaches that you can take, that you can read, that you could delve into, and then you start to build your momentum up one piece at a time until eventually you build that aura. And then you can start to dive into what Hardik was initially saying. Hey, I want to manage a pros. ECS. Okay, what's a task definition? Right? It's a blueprint. That's essentially it for your application. Now you can talk to that point when you're having conversations with your customers, and you start to think about, okay, what are other things? All right, I learned ECS. I went down the route. Then I go to EKS and the best practices for that, because that's the other side. Hardik said it's more freedom. But I think this starts to go into the L200. Why? Because you have that freedom. So there's a lot more that you have to consider with that when it comes to the security, reliability, and all those things in between. So you become more of a wasteland security specialist. And how many times have you guys looked at the EKS best practices guide? I think I live in this guide.
Definitely. I'm in the best practices for security pretty regularly.
It's a very important place to start, because you're like, all right, I have to understand the best practices and also what guidance is, especially when you're at that L200 level, because it's like, okay, I got past the definitions and understanding the words and how to put them together in a sentence. But we also need to figure out, okay, what is everybody else doing? And that's where the prescriptive guidance comes in. And that's where the guidance really comes to play, because, hey, this was a bunch of people who took this road before and says, hey, don't go down this road. And if you go down this road, this is what's going to happen. And that's where the guidance stems and kind of level up from. Because once you know all the different roads and you know the different approaches, then you can start to get to the level of a legendary knight elite. And essentially, you get knighted of saying, hey, one, thank you for saying it's an interesting stream. I'm glad that you're motivated to get your first cert. I would suggest a security cert, but we're all biased on this thing. So, foundational items and approaches and kind of, I think workshops is where you start to get that legendary status, because you start to play around with what you're actually reading. And I think that's a fun part of just being able to play around and understand how the bits and bytes work together. And I am permissions. So I pose this to the panel. Good place to start for a workshop, especially with EKS.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because least privilege, right? That's one of the things that now I say it 4 times. I'm keeping count. After reported to Hardik later, I said it 4 times, least privilege. So go forth and do it. But when you think of how do I get to the legendary knight elite status, this is, you go through something like this where, hey, what is the EKS pod identity and how do I implement least privilege into EKS? Because it's all important parts of the puzzle. Because when you're trying to build aura and you start to get to the point of, hey, I need to understand this over here or this over here or this down, you go to the documentation. You start to think about things a different way. You start to view it just like how you're looking at us right now. It's a little bit different way. Is our point coming across? Maybe, maybe not. But at least we're in circles. So if we go and understand how we start to approach the documentation and leading up to a workshop, now we can start to get into dev, and then we can start to get into understanding, hey, how do I build a pipeline? What do I need to, oh, I read about this thing over here, that inspector, I need to put it in my pipeline. So if we were to summarize this, and I'll throw the ball to Hardik, if you were to kind of recap, what are some of the important foundational points to help get us from a vault dweller to a legendary knight?
Sure. So starting right from the top, right, given that there are challenges that everyone runs into day to day, which is having secrets coded in your Docker files, like devs embedding them. Avoid that. Ensure you're using Secrets Manager. You're ensuring scanning your images at a CI/CD level in the pipeline, as Tristan mentioned. The second challenge that we have is running containers as root, which you should not. This can be blocked using OPA, Open Policy Agent policies. There are several out there that you can leverage and use, but also like running them with least privilege. We can make the count 5. Lack of visibility into the workloads, as someone had suggested. Definitely, we need to have auditing enabled. Use CloudTrail, bundle it up and power it up with guard duty because that really helps. Ensure that you're doing EKS logging. You can also use FluentBit, really helps to get that granularity and level. There are other things also there that you can add on to it. From an IAM over permissioning perspective, make sure that you're using IAM policy boundaries, having SCPs in place, using IAM roles for service accounts, and integrating them. So that way you're able to manage and fail and check everything properly. And then also kind of ensuring that you're frequently making new images, clean images, and locking down the old ones. So that way, that's the whole point of containers, right? Like bring them down as quickly and then spin them up back as quickly as you can so that you're always running things with latest security best practices.
Yeah. And I would say that is a very important part of just understanding what containers are, right? And understanding the purpose of what they serve helps to kind of carve out, like, okay, I don't maybe need all of this in my container because I need to spin these items up quickly, as you mentioned. And then the less stuff you have, less of an attack surface. And I would say, and Russ, correct me if I'm wrong, from your side, usually a lot of bloat leads to, trips to the doctor's office, right? The more candy you eat, the more it just expedites, right? So those are kind of things that you probably see on your side as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. And I think that's an important part, as well as just delving in and understanding the different concepts. And I keep going back to this because it's an important part, because when you look at the container mountain, it looks huge. But if you break it down to a little bit, a pebble here, boulder here, then eventually you kind of level up yourself through the side quests. As I say, 1 XP, 2 XP, 3 XP, 4 XP. Eventually you're going to level up. Maybe slow, maybe fast, but it depends on what journeys and what quests and kind of how much you wander around the wasteland. Yeah, decided to bring it full circle around there. But, Russ, I know there's one thing that you always like to leave off on.
Is there? Just kidding. No, creator and incident response plan.
Yeah. And that's a very important part of the puzzle, because when you're thinking about, hey, that auditing, and I keep going back to that because somebody mentioned it, so I got to keep saying it 3 times for that. But it's part of the puzzle. And what I mean by it's part of the puzzle, it's one of the pieces of your defense in depth, of your circle, of your cake, the layered dessert of your appetizer. And yes, we have appetizer for dessert. But I also want to say thank you to our great sage, Hardik, for guiding us around our foundational approaches to understanding, right, the power of the cloud. Yeah. And Hardik, do you have any closing words to the audience?
Yeah, the closing words is the same as what I started with. It's to get defense in depth, always take the layered approach, and don't forget, like, no matter where you start, be it left or right, it's always, you have to ensure that you are closing that circle, right? Like, start from left or right, but make sure you're having that holistic approach and securing your containers or any other workload.
Yes, definitely. Couldn't have said it better myself, because I would add in a lot of desserts and appetizers and things of that nature. But I think that side quests, that's a different, let's say, conversation for a different day. So thank you to everybody who, listen to us ramble on about containers and container security. So until next time, build Aura, keep on side questing, and have fun. Take care.
Create an incident response plan.
All right. Take it easy.